So, when was the last time you kind of made a big mistake? You failed in some way, maybe a significant fail. Chances are you haven't failed as big as this woman from the TV show The Price is Right. Take a look at what happened.
3 out of 5. 3 chances to give me the price tag to the Hyundai Sonata SE.
It's the surprising Price is Right mistake that everyone is talking about.
$19,849. $19,849. Go ahead, Manuela. Boot. No.
Oh, is right. Model Manuela Arbalez accidentally revealed the winning price before the contestant could make her second guess. And now she's reliving the moment exclusively with Inside Edition.
I was mortified. I was mortified because I thought this is my last day at work. B, it's gonna get taken out of my paycheck every week.
Congratulations, Manuela just gave you a car.
How about that? I'm sure she was grateful. By the way, she didn't get fired. They didn't dock her pay. The producers loved it because it was just an accident, and they actually played the episode. Oh my goodness, but what a mistake. Can you imagine? I mean, she wanted to hide, right? I mean, how would we all feel? You fail like that in a public way? And all of us have our failure stories. If we open it up and say, hey, tell about a time when you failed, you'd be like, oh my goodness, this time my zipper was open, I had something in my teeth, I tripped walking into the room, and down you go. And so it's like we all have these fail stories. And sometimes our failures aren't too big a deal, right? Not too costly, not too expensive, and we can move on from them. But sometimes those failures can really impact us. I was listening to a man talk about his failures, and at an early age, he failed, and at the same time, he had older siblings who were incredibly successful, and so he was comparing himself to them, and he became terrified of failure at a young age. Matter of fact, he said when he got into high school, in middle school, he was the leading scorer on their basketball team. But in high school, he wouldn't even try out for the team because in high school, you have to try out. And he was so afraid that if he tried and failed, it would just be devastating to him. So he just thought, I'm just not going to even try. Same thing with soccer. All his life to that point, he played soccer. He loved soccer. But if you try out in high school for soccer, you might not make the team. And he was so scared of not making the team that he wouldn't even try. So what sport can everybody join? Cross country. So that's what he joined, because they'll let anyone run, because it was safe. And he didn't have to worry about failing. And he said he brought this same attitude into his grades too, because his siblings were smart and athletic. He's like, what if I try in this class and I can't do as well as them? So he said, I didn't even try. Some of you know what this is like. You know what it's like to be afraid of failing at something, and so afraid that you don't even really try. And a lot of opportunities are missed, and especially spiritually. A lot of people miss out on the opportunity to connect deeply with God and experience the adventure He has because we're afraid. We're afraid that if we say yes, He'll ask us to do something that's really hard, and we will fail. And this isn't the life God has for us. God doesn't want us to be afraid. God has something so much better for each of us on the other side of fear. And so that's why we've been in this little series for a while now called No Fear. And today we're going to continue that by talking about failure, and I'm going to tweak the title a little bit. If you grab your notes, I want to ask you to write a different title under there. So I have on your notes how to overcome the fear of failure. Actually, what we're really talking about is how to come back from a failure. That's what we're actually talking about today. Like the woman like the model on The Price is Right. You got to come back from your failures. So how do you do it? Because if you don't handle this right, sometimes you don't come back from your failures and you just get scared and it really affects you for the rest of your life, and I don't want that for you. So I want to ask you to grab your program, grab your notes, and welcome to, of course, those of you who are watching online. We're glad that you're watching, and if you go to our website at penulchurchlife.com, you can grab these notes as well. Let's jump right into this, and of course, in typical fashion, we're starting with point 2, ignore point 1. So if you want to recover from failure, the first thing we're going to talk about this is you have to send yourself the right messages. You want to recover from failure, you got to send yourself the right messages. As I was prepping, of course, I read a lot of failure stories. And I read about this man in college who He saw this girl in class one day and she was the one. He was smitten and in love with her. He was so scared to ask her out. And finally, months went by before he finally worked up the courage to ask her out. And she said, the kiss of death, "No, but we can still be friends, right?" And everybody who's ever heard that is like, "Sure we can be." But he was devastated, of course, at his young years. He said he wanted to crawl into a hole. He said he felt like he walked around that entire next week with a loser on his forehead. You know what that feels like? To try something and have it fail and to just want to crawl into a hole. Matter of fact, he said he never wanted to ask anyone out again because he was sure that they were going to say the same thing anyway. So some of you know what that feels like. You know what it's like to fail at something and then feel like, I don't want to do it again because I'm just going to fail again anyway. And here's what I want you to understand, and that's a great example because many of you have had that experience. So here's what I want you to understand about failure. Failure is not the issue, but the messages that we send ourselves after we fail, that's the issue. Because what the self-talk we do after we fail is going to determine whether we become really afraid of failure or we don't become afraid of failure. And a couple of really important self-talk messages are these. After you fail, send yourself the right message, and message number one is, everyone fails. There are no exceptions to this. Everyone fails. You're not alone. That boy in college was not alone. Everyone fails. I love how clearly the Bible states it. Look at this verse in James chapter 3. We all stumble in many ways. Matter of fact, if anyone is never at fault in what he says or she says, he is a perfect man, able to keep his whole body in check. And of course, this is where we're all supposed to laugh. It's like, of course nobody is that way. Nobody never fails in words that come out of their mouth. Everybody fails. And if you could control your mouth, he said you could control everything about your life, but we can't control either of them. So we fail all the time. Matter of fact, do you ever think about the fact that when God made us, he hardwired failure into our lives? Go watch a baby, and you will see failure, right? Constant failure. And all of you don't remember this, but when you tried to crawl the first time, you failed. And you failed tons and tons of times. You could get up and rock, and what would happen? Bam, down you'd go. First time you tried to stand up, you pulled yourself up, and what happened? You fell right down. First time you tried to walk, you don't remember this, but you failed over and over again. Same like the first time you tried to run, first time you tried to ride a bike, first time you tried to throw a ball, even the first time you tried to eat, you failed and failed and failed and failed, right? You ever think about it? God hardwired us. We failed thousands and thousands of times before we hit kindergarten. It's like he hardwired failure into us. It's like you got to be okay with the fact that everyone fails. And sometimes the fails are way more serious than this. This is one of the things I like about the Bible is that ancient religious documents oftentimes made people into heroes, like these perfect specimens. And the Bible doesn't. The Bible just records the failures of the people who followed God. Like Peter. So Peter's one of Jesus' core disciples. And you know what happens to Jesus on the night Judas is betraying him. Jesus tells his disciples, you're all going to fall away. And what does Peter say? Oh, no, not me. Everyone else fall away, but I will never leave you, Jesus. I got your back. And what does Jesus say? Before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. And it's exactly what happens, this colossal failure, and Peter's so ashamed. Everybody fails. Everybody fails. There are no exceptions to the everybody fails thing. So this is really critical that you understand this, because here's what many Americans in our society believe. Some of you believe this. If I fail, I am a failure. And by the way, the I am is really the key thing, because the I am messages that we say to ourselves determine how we are going to feel about ourselves. So if you put this message in your mind after you fail, you are in big trouble, because the truth is not this. This is not the truth. If I fail, I'm a failure. The truth is this. If I fail, I am a human. That's what the truth is, because everybody fails. So we need to take and normalize failure rather than making it something that's unique only to you. And when you fail, that's one of the messages that's inside. Oh my goodness, look at me. Something's wrong with me because I failed. No, you're just a human. Everybody fails. God literally wired it into the system. We were going to fail. But there's more to say to ourselves when we fail. And one of the things that's critical to say is, oh, I have to fail because I have to fail my way to success. And this is not well known, especially in our society today, is that people fail their way to success. The book of Proverbs talks about what happens when good people fall, and it says, even if good people fall 7 times, they're going to get back up, but when trouble strikes the wicked, that's the end. And he's pointing out this idea of persevering when you fall, you get back up and keep going. And here's the reason why this is so significant, is because failure is often the thing that God uses to make you successful. Now, that is not well known in American society because people actually think that people become successful without failure. We look around at the people that are really rich and really successful, and we have no idea how many times they failed. You ever heard of this man? Scott Adams? You ever read the cartoon Dilbert? So incredibly popular cartoon, super successful cartoonist. One day he was contacted by a man who was a teacher, and he taught disabled students. And one of his disabled students wanted to become a cartoonist. And so, on a whim, the teacher just reached out to Scott Adams and said, hey, do you have any advice for him? One of my students who's disabled wants to be a cartoonist, and he really likes your work. Do you have any advice for him? And Scott Adams wrote him back. And he said, yeah. He said, tell your student that most success springs from failure. He said, I became a cartoonist largely because I failed in my goal of becoming a successful executive. So this is what I wanted to be, and I tried and failed and tried and failed and tried and failed, and finally I'm like, well, what else do I like to do? I kind of like drawing cartoons, and super success came on the other side of super failure. You know that, right? You know that. You fail your way to success. That's how this works. I mean, in my life, there have been so many times that I have failed my way to success. You can only fail your way to success. Very rarely does the first thing we try ever work out perfectly. So somebody may be listening to this and going, okay, all right, well, I'm going to go home and fail. I'm going to go home today, I'm going to start failing at everything because if I fail, I become a success, right? Well, it's not automatic. Most of you are smart enough to know that. You have to do the next thing. You have to analyze your failures. If you're going to recover from your failures, you got to have the right message in your mind. Everyone fails, and I have to fail my way to success. And then you have to analyze the failures in your life. Years ago, I used to work with this young woman who used to call me her work dad, because I'm her dad's age. And so we stopped working together years ago, but I still keep in touch with her through LinkedIn, and I was checking on her this week because I knew she'd been through a couple of jobs recently, and several jobs, and I knew she wasn't enjoying the job she was in, and I just wanted to see how she's doing. And she wrote back and she said, I felt like such a failure at my last 2 jobs. You ever felt that way? Ever felt like a failure at a job? That's not a good feeling. Then she wrote this. She said, but I've come to realize that it's because I didn't take the time to find a good fit for myself. I kept trying to force myself into these new experiences instead of finding a place where my skills are going to shine on their own and I don't have to try and change who I am. And I was like, way to go. Great self-realization, right? She's doing exactly what we're talking about right now. She's failing and going, okay, what do I need to learn from my failures? Now, failure can lead to success. Failure doesn't automatically lead to success. Isn't that true? Aren't there many, many people in our lives who just fail? And they never become successful because they never learn from their failures. So one of my favorite phrases, I'm going to have you drop down to letter B, is from one of my favorite authors, Jim Collins. He is a very successful business author, and he said, listen, the only way to make this work is you autopsy your failures. So when you have a failure, you know what an autopsy is? Like, well, this didn't work. We need to tear this apart and think about, why did this fail? What's gone wrong? So it has been a habit in my life for 20 years to autopsy my failures. Because the truth is, and I know this, do you know this? There are some things you only learn through failure. Do you know that? I wish we only learned everything from success, but we tend not to learn much of anything when we're successful. But we can learn a ton from our failures. Isn't it true that you learn how to persevere by failing, right? You fail, and you learn how to get up and go again. And you fail, and you can learn how to get up and go again. We learn some things only through failing. We learn how to invite new perspectives because we're trying something, it's not working, trying something, and then somebody says something to us. Have you ever said these words? Oh, I never thought of it that way before. You ever said those words? All of a sudden, you took in a new perspective, and you're like, boy, I don't know everything. Maybe I should talk to other people that know more than I do. Some of those things we only learn through failure. Blind spots, things that I'm not good at. We learn those through failure because you try them and you're like, oh boy, this is just something I should not do for a career. I'm not good at it. Maybe I thought I was good and I keep doing it wrong. It's like, nope. We learn humility through failure. Do you know how awful we would all be if everything we tried worked the first time? We would be egomaniacs. We learn humility by trying something and realizing we're not God. We're not all-knowing, all-powerful. And we really learn empathy by trying and failing. Because when we watch someone else try and fail, we're like, oh, I know what that feels like. You know, I know exactly what that young boy felt like when the girl turned him down and said, can't we still be friends? How many of you know exactly what that feels like? And you're like, some part of you's like, oh, sorry, kid. We know that, right? And empathy comes from those experiences. There are some things you only learn by trial and error. Matter of fact, in the Old Testament, when the nation of Israel had gone astray and turned away from God, the prophet Jeremiah tried to get them back by using this tactic. Look what he said to him. The Lord, through Jeremiah, said, people of Jerusalem, when you stumble and fall, you get back up, and if you take a wrong road, you turn around and go back. So he says, think about it. If you're trying to go to Bethlehem and you get on the road taking you to Jericho, you start down this road and you're like, wait, I don't want to go to Jericho, I want to go to Bethlehem. And what do? You turn. And you learn from what you've done wrong. And he was saying, listen, why don't you learn from what's going wrong in the nation? We have walked away from God. We are having terrible consequences, but we never learned from it. And Jeremiah is saying, learn from your mistakes. So flip your notes over on the back. At the very bottom, there's a section called Evaluating Our Failures. What did I learn? What mistakes were made? Why did it happen? What could I have done differently? What could I do better next time? Who could I talk to about this? I literally have a folder in my computer. Actually, it's got a number of entries. Whenever I have a colossal failure, I autopsy the failure. I sit down with my laptop and I go, what did I do wrong? What did I do wrong? What did I miss? How do I prevent this from ever happening again? And I go through and I process the failure so I don't have to repeat it. Because success doesn't automatically happen on the other side of failure. It happens on the other side of failures that you've analyzed. Some of you are old enough to remember this man. Remember his face? Maybe you remember his commercials. His name was Victor Kiam. Victor Kiam. I think it's Kiam. He owned Remington Razor. That's what he's holding in his hand. So he had bought this company years ago. He used to do all these cheesy commercials. I like the company so much I bought it. And so he made a ton of money from this product. And so somebody once asked him about failure. And incredibly, he said this. He said he had a huge failure when he was a young entrepreneur. He had the opportunity to buy exclusive rights on a brand new product that had just been invented that he got connected with. And he loved the product. He thought it was going to be incredibly successful. But some of the people in his life who he trusted said, no, this is a gimmick. It's a fad. Nobody will ever want to ever buy this thing called Velcro. And so he listened to them and turned it down. He could have exclusively owned Velcro. Can you imagine the wealth? Years and years later, he was talking about failure. He said, it was just a blip in the road. A blip in the road! But he could say that because he said, if I hadn't learned from that lapse of judgment by not having confidence in myself, I never would have bought Remington. You hear what he's saying? I learned. Here's what I did wrong. I'm never going to let this happen again. And because he learned from it, Remington, and he became successful. My question to you is, are you learning from your failures or just repeating them? If I were to ask you to think about the last time, think about the things that are really painful in your life today. Are you learning from them? Are you spending time thinking about, what did I do wrong? How do I prevent this from ever happening again? It's one of the most important things to do. All right. So if you want to recover from your failures, and you're going to have them, you've got to learn how to, think the right way about them, and you've got to learn how to analyze them. But there's another piece that is, to me, the most important. I've saved it for last, and I hope it's something that really makes sense. It makes sense to me, and I'm a little concerned about my ability to communicate this to you. When you failed, if you want to recover, the grace of God has to become your focus. I hope I can help you understand this. You need to focus, and again, this is self-talk again. His grace needs to become your focus when you've failed. Here's why. I've led for over 3 decades now. For over 3 decades, I've been leading. Almost all of that in the church, but I've led in other arenas of my life too. I've said before, the hardest thing about failure for me isn't the actual failure. I don't have a problem telling you all that I've failed many, many times. I don't have a problem telling you I've failed in my past, that I'm failing right now in some areas of my life, and I will fail again in the future. That doesn't make me uncomfortable in any way. What makes me uncomfortable and causes me to really struggle with the topic of failure is how people around me respond when they discover that I'm not perfect. That's what hurts the most. I can't tell you how many times in my life I've made the wrong decision as a leader. And then people have responded with anger. One time this woman came in with 4 pages of things that she didn't like about me. One time this man came at me verbally in the worst verbal abuse I'd had in my whole life. And I know now he wanted me to blow up so he could really come at me and say, look, Brian's out of control. I mean, those are the moments that really get me. It's not my failure itself, it's how people respond when you fail. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about because you failed and you had somebody label you. Or you failed and you lost a friendship because you failed. You failed and now those people won't even look at you or talk to you and they treat you like you're lesser. That to me is when the I am messages take root in my mind. It's like, oh, I'm not worthy. I'm not a good person. I am. It's not the failure itself, it's how people respond. When I see how much I've hurt people, that's when I really, really struggle with those internal negative I am messages. And that's where the grace of God is just critical that you learn this. So, for fun, when I want to read in the Bible, I often go to these 6 books. If you like history, I love history. So, these 6 books of the Bible contain some amazing history of the nation of Israel's growth and their first kings through the end of their time as a kingdom. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings are in the Old Testament. They all go right in a row, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And I just love them. I've read them over and over again in my lifetime. And I read them for fun, and I'm reading through them right now, and that's why I'm telling you this. It's because a couple of weeks ago I read something that just really struck me hard when I read it. So if I asked you to name any of the kings of Israel, maybe you couldn't name too many, but probably all of you have heard of a guy named David, right? King David. You know, the old Sunday school story that many of you heard about David and Goliath. So chances are, if you can't name many of the kings of Israel, you probably know about King David. And you probably could tell at least some of the story of David and Goliath. But there's another big story in David's life after he becomes king. It's really kind of the other big story that David's known for. It's David and Bathsheba. So David The kingdom of God, the kingdom of Israel has really grown under David's leadership. And one day, it said at the time when the kings go out to war, David didn't go. He sent his army and he stayed home, and he was, bored one day. He was up on the roof of his palace. He sees a woman bathing. Now, instead of doing the integrity thing and looking away, he didn't look away. He's the king, so he sent for her, and he has sex with her, and she gets pregnant. And her husband is one of his soldiers out fighting for him. And so now all of a sudden, we've got a problem because she's pregnant. Everyone will know she's committed adultery because her husband isn't even here. And so if you know the story, he tries at first to get her husband to come back and sleep with her so that, look, you just came back and you happen to have a baby now. But he has so much integrity that while his soldiers are in the field, he will not even go home. And so finally, the only thing David has left to do, rather than confess it, is to kill him. And so he kills him. He sends a message to his general saying, put this guy in the front where the fighting is fiercest and then withdraw from him, and I want him dead. And the general obeys him, and Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, is killed. And so then she's a widow, and so then it's fine for him to marry her. And then, oh, look, we're pregnant already. Oh, what a surprise. Oh, and it's premature. Oh, my goodness. Wow. And he thinks he's gotten away with it and covered the whole thing up. I mean, you're talking about gross abuse of power, murder, adultery, lying. I mean, you're talking about a list of great evil here, right? God is so frustrated and upset at what happens, he sends his prophet Nathan to confront David. How would you like that job? How would you like to be the prophet who has to go confront the king who's already killed to cover this up? But Nathan goes and he confronts David, and David, incredibly, instead of becoming defensive and angry and attacking the prophet, instead he falls on his knees, he repents, he confesses it all. The Bible says he comes clean about his sin. He apologizes to God. He asks for forgiveness. He tells the truth of what he's done. And God says, you won't die for this, but he's going to have a tremendous amount of consequences. And there are a lot of things. As a matter of fact, for a while, he doesn't even get to be king of the nation anymore. But then the grace of God kicks in, and David is restored. And he becomes king again. And then, like all human beings, his time on earth comes to an end. He dies. So I'm reading this story, I'm like, wow. It's been a while since I've read this. Like, wow, this is dark. Well, then David's son Solomon takes over, and then he dies, and then on come, his grandkids and great-grandkids and become kings. And if you've ever read through any of those books, some of his grandkids are screwed up people. I mean, they're a mess. Really a mess. And one time, God sends a prophet to one of David's great-great-grandkids who's totally screwed up, but ruling the nation, leading the nation away from God. And here's what he said, and this just blew me away when I read it. Look at what he says. The prophet, speaking from God, confronts that king and says, "You've not been like my servant David, who obeyed my commands and followed me with all his heart and always did whatever I wanted." Wait a second. Did you just catch what he said about David? What God said about David? God said through his prophet, years after David had died, that David was a man who followed me with all his heart and always did what I wanted. Now, did David always do what God wanted? The obvious answer is no, right? Because God didn't want him to kill Uriah, and God didn't want him to commit adultery, and God didn't want him to lie. God didn't want any of that. And yet, that's not how God looked at him. Matter of fact, if you read those books, you will see this again and again and again, where God sends a message through his prophets saying, listen, why won't you be more like David? A man after my own heart. And you're like, wait a second, he was a murderer. How can you say this, God? And then all of a sudden, as I was thinking about this over the last few weeks, it just dawned on me, and here's what I think it means. That God doesn't define me by my worst failures in life. God doesn't define you by your worst failures in life. Now, if you haven't had a big failure, that may not be all that significant to you, but I have. I've had some big failures in my life. There are a lot of things you can do when you're the pastor of a church, and you get to continue to do that, but getting divorced is not one of them. And some of you know my story. I got divorced years ago. And like I said, the failure's hard enough, but how people respond when you fail, that's brutal. And over again, in the worst time of my life, the cruelty of people was just staggering to me. And the things that they would say and the justification they felt in saying awful things to me about what they knew had happened. It's like, you don't know me. You know nothing. And the unkindness of it all. And they want to definitely define, even all these years later, there's still people who won't even look at me, talk to me, or say hi to me. Years and years later. All these years later. They still define me by my failure. And I do not deny it was a failure. Obviously, how could I? But when I read this and I realized the truth of this, that God never defines me by my worst failure in life. It's so significant that you understand this. Because he always gives you the do-over opportunity. And here's why. The reason why is really important. Is because through faith in Jesus, here's what you become. Here's your true I am statement. I am his deeply loved child. That's who I actually am. That's who David was. That's why God didn't define him as the adulterer and the murderer. He defined him by who he actually was, his dearly loved son. Through faith in Jesus, this is what you become. This is your true I am. And Galatians points it out. He says, you're all children of God through faith in Christ Jesus. This is who you become. So here's what this means and why this is so significant to me spiritually when I read stories like this in the Bible, is I am always one thing. I am always one thing. I am always his dearly loved child, period. That's my true identity. If you ask me who I am, I'm going to say that. I am a dearly loved son of God. That's who I am. Through faith in Jesus, that is your true identity. You are his son or daughter, period. I am not my biggest failure. And the truth is, just like David, I get to come back from it. So do you. You do too. And the truth is, and what this means is I get to start over with God every day. We sang a song about his mercies are new every morning. That's a promise in the Bible. Every day is a do-over day with God. And it doesn't matter how far you've gone, how much you've done. The truth is, in the story that Jesus told with the prodigal son proves it, is that God never gets tired of taking you back, ever, ever. There's never a time when he's like, oh, I'm so exhausted from this person. They're just wearing me out. Nope, never. He's always waiting for us to turn so that the moment we turn to him, he can forgive and restore us. He never gets tired of taking us back, even if we're apologizing for the 1,000th time for the exact same thing. We always get to start over with him because we're his beloved son or daughter. But here's the big one. What God is capable of doing is making the rest of my life the best of my life. Because isn't it true in this world, when you fail, there are some people who are just done with you. And God is never done with you. And there are some people in this world who will give up on you. And God will never give up on you. Now, do we deserve this? Of course not. That's why it's called grace. This is what God offers everyone. His grace toward me saved me and healed me and restored me. And that's what he can do for every human being. So a couple of things as we finish up today. If you think about some failures in your life, has the failure in your life created a fear of failing? Are you afraid of failing today? Are there risks you're not taking because you're just afraid that if you take them, it may not work out? Again, we got to normalize failure. Does everybody fail? Everybody fails. And if you read the Bible, you will see we fail in huge ways. It's just understood. And you can fail your way to success only if you do this one, learn from it. And I really want to challenge you, especially if you have a big regret in your life. Do you have a failure that haunts you? Something that you think about regularly, it keeps coming back in your mind? Some of you do. What if God is putting that in your mind because he wants you to learn something from it, because there's something you can learn, and if you learn this, it'll save you from pain in your future? What if our God of love is doing this for you because he wants you to learn and he cares about you? So don't just ignore it. If you have a failure that haunts you, really sit down and give some thought. What did I do right? What did I do wrong? Think about who you can get some advice from and learn from it. But the most important thing I'd say to you, if you want to recover from your failures, you got to let God's message about you be the focus of your mind. You've got to find your identity in him, so that if I say, "Who are you?" you answer this one way: I'm his son, I'm his daughter. That's who I am. And nothing will ever change that. My failures won't change that. My mistakes won't change that. And he will never get tired of me. This is who I am. Let me have you bow your heads. Maybe the next step spiritually is to let him give you this incredible gift of grace. The promise in the Bible is that we can become his children through faith in Jesus Christ. And if this is the role you want to step into with God, he is willing. Because the Bible says very clearly, like James says, the book of James, we've all fallen and sinned in so many ways. We've stumbled in so many ways. And none of us have kept perfect words or perfect behavior, and it is serious to God, so serious that he gave his only son, Jesus, to die for us. And Jesus paid the price on the cross and rose again so that he could extend grace and mercy to every human being. And if you want this new relationship with him where you become his son or daughter, you just have to receive it. It's a gift he holds out freely to all of us. If you want it, with your head bowed, your eyes closed, you can say something like this to him. Say, "Jesus, I take your gift today. I want to be your child from this day forward. I want your grace in my life. Please forgive me, Jesus, for what I've done. With the faith I have, I'm turning to you today and asking for this in Jesus' name. Amen." So I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to watch this service online today. If you found it helpful, we always love to hear from people who are watching online. You can send us an email through the church website. If you go to penuelchurchlife.com, in the upper right-hand corner is a box that says, "I said yes to Jesus," or "I have a prayer request." If you click in that, you can communicate with us as a church. So if you do have something you want us to pray about, put it in there and send it to us, and we'll pray for you as a church. Or if you prayed the prayer at the end of the service and you want to let us know about that, give us your name and address, and we'll send you some material in the mail as a follow-up, as a way to encourage you in the next steps to grow spiritually. But again, thanks so much for taking the time to watch this service today, and we hope that God's great blessing rests on you.